Down here, things only get better with time. It's why we perfected the art of the scenic route, and why we also love a game that takes all day to play. It's why we know that when we welcome old friends again, everything that's great here will be even better. 'Cause whether it's a long walk, a long lunch, or a long-awaited hello, there's nothing like Australia.
Good morning to those joining us in India and good afternoon to those in Australia. I'm Petula Thomas, Director of the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce for our members in India and Australia. And on behalf of the Chamber, I'd like to welcome you to this session, Fintech-Shaping the Future, Evolving Fintech Landscape in India. We've got a fabulous panel, a moderator and 4 panelists. We can't wait to start the session. Just a little bit of background and a little about the fintech industry to set the scene. So the adoption of the fintech industry in India has been rapid, driven by a surge in e-commerce, use of smartphones, and growth in internet penetration. The launch of government initiatives such as Digital India have created infrastructural support for the sector. The sector has witnessed a massive surge in investments from USD 1.9 billion in 2018 to USD 3.7 billion in 2019. Fintech activity in Australia has also witnessed rapid growth. Sydney and Melbourne are prominent fintech hubs in Australia. Both India and Australia have a dynamic fintech sector. Both countries can therefore have knowledge and technology sharing agreements to foster innovation and enable mutual growth. So there's plenty of opportunity for dialogue, and that's why we have this initiative and such fabulous speakers to talk about some of this today. A few housekeeping points to note. So in order to reduce background noise, all microphones will be muted during this session, apart from the person speaking. At the end of the session, the panel will be taking questions. You can use the question section on the RHS to ask questions. Also, please note that we are recording the session and the recorded version will be made available to delegates and participants. Also, the session is being streamed live on the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce's YouTube channel. So without further ado, let me introduce the moderator for today's session and hand over to her. So the moderator is Ms. Soumya Thankala, Senior Associate Guidance Tamil Nadu. The Chamber works very closely with the government of Tamil Nadu and are very grateful for the collaboration that we have with them. So Soumya is Senior Associate Guidance Tamil Nadu. She is an investment promotion specialist with more than 4 years of experience in working with various states. In her current role, she is leading the IT sector investment promotion for the state of Tamil Nadu and has made a significant contribution to the emergence of Chennai as a hotspot for the data centers in 6 months. She is also working towards accelerating fintech investments and creating a fintech ecosystem in the state. Prior to joining Guidance Tamil Nadu, she worked with the Ministry of Electronics and IT, Government of Andhra Pradesh, and was instrumental in conceptualizing and executing the Fintech Valley Vizag initiative. So with that, Soumya, I will hand over to you, and I look forward, like many of our viewers, to the session that will commence. Over to you.
Thank you for such a nice introduction, Ms. Thomas. A very good afternoon to friends in Australia and a very good morning to friends in India. It's a great pleasure to welcome the delegates, speakers, special invitees, and our panelists to the session on Shaping the Future, Evolving Fintech Landscape in India. As we all know, and as Ms. Thomas mentioned, we have seen a phenomenal growth in the number of new ventures launched in the fintech space, driven by adoption. We have over 2,000 fintech firms in India as of 2020, with a total funding of around $5.4 billion during 2019 to 20. And India stands second in the EY Fintech Adoption Index rankings 2019, next to China, and is much ahead of other developed countries. The future of fintech in India looks shining with the formalization of digital ID, a high level of banking penetration, increased smartphone usage, continuous build-up of the digital infrastructure, and streamlining of financial processes across the sectors. Today, we have an amazing panel who will be talking about the inherent strengths of India and the possibilities of emergence of fintech hubs in cities like Chennai, Bangalore, and Mumbai. We'll take a few moments to briefly introduce each of the panelists, and then seek the views on the topic. After that, I'll kick off the conversation asking questions that can draw out some of the high-level trends that we should be talking about. And then at the end, we will take the questions from audience on the AirMeet platform. Let's start with the panel introduction. We have Mr. Dilip Murali, founder and CEO of Jetco Technologies. Dilip has more than 20 years of experience in product development and has worked in various organizations that include NetApp, ECI Telecom. In 2012, he decided to pursue his dreams for starting up and started Jetco, an augmented data management company that drives insights through data by combining machine learning and contextual intelligence. Welcome, Dilip. Next, we have Mr. Karl Mohan, General Manager at New, an advanced global payments platform. Karl is a seasoned financial services executive with experience across banking, fintech, and energy. He has a thorough understanding of the regulatory environment in Australia and New Zealand and has built relationships with regulators and payment networks such as Visa and MasterCard. Welcome, Karl. And then we have Mr. Ben Ford, advisor at OneLens. OneLens is a technology platform that creates growth value for startups and scale-ups across commercial opportunities and investment opportunities. Welcome, Mr. Ben. So let's start the in opening remarks with Dilip. Can you share your few thoughts on how the fintech landscape has evolved in India? As you've been in the Indian startup ecosystem since 2012, what do you think has changed significantly for Indian fintech startups?
Thanks for having me on this panel today. The Indian ecosystem, especially in fintech, has seen a lot of growth in the last 3 to 4 years, and we've been here since 2012. I spent a good amount of time in the US, came back 2012. For the first couple of years since 2012 till maybe about 2015, 16, I think there was a lot of uncertainty around how India will eventually make it big into the fintech space. But in the last 3 to 4 years, the number of startups that have come in have changed the whole game to a completely different level. Given the fact that we now have new neobanks which are launching, to a massive change in the way payments are being made, in the way how banks are adopting new fintech products and launching their own fintech products. So right now we are in the cusp of becoming something, a global fintech giant, and that aided with data. I think India is looking at a major revolution in the fintech space in the coming 2 to 3 years.
Thank you, Dilip. Moving on to Karl, as you have operations across the APAC region, where do you find India more relevant to a fintech business? Is it the market opportunity or tech talent for the product development or the favorable financial systems and regulations? What is your take on this?
Hey, look, thanks a lot, Soumya, firstly, for having me on the panel today. Look, I'll start with generally my experience through Neum. Look, we're a global payments company. We believe in open banking. And in fact, when we first started, we sort of pioneered the ability to remit funds from Australia to India and vice versa in a very fast, cheap, and transparent manner. And that got us started originally back in 2015. And if I look at India today and where we are with that, is in two folds. One is definitely from a tech talent perspective, and we're not talking about just development talent. We have majority of our product people out in India as well, given the ability to strategize and create new service offering, just as Dilip mentioned. And second is we look at it as a significant market in two folds, right? One is a fast-growing middle class that has got a very high adoption to technology, and including, a very strong penetration of mobile phones. Most of them are mobile natives. And second, there's a strong diaspora network that has link back to India as well. I mean, before we started this call, Dilip and I were having the same conversation. I'm of Indian diaspora origin, and still have a connection and affinity to India. So I think that's where we're seeing that connection, tech talent, product, and also the linkage between the diaspora network linking back to India.
Thank you, Carl. Now, Ben, as you've been with the startups and the scale-ups across the Australian fintech ecosystem, what is your take on what are the strengths of Australia?
Thanks, Soumya, and just echo the comments of the other guys in thank you for putting this session together. In terms of the Australian ecosystem, I think there's a lot of parallels with the Indian ecosystem, which sort of seems a bit bizarre given the sort of massive disparate nature of the two countries in terms of population and things like that. But I think what we've seen in Australia, albeit on a relatively sort of narrow scale compared to India, is the tenacity and I guess sort of the entrepreneurial spirit and the will to win leading the way with certain companies, becoming global phenomenons almost. I think another similarity, I guess, is the focus on certain niches that have a larger proportion of interest within the fintech space. So certainly India is sort of heavily led by payments initiatives and things like that. I think in Australia, to a large extent, there's been a huge focus, or a lot of the fintech interest and investment and maturity is around about lending and now buy now, pay later. But before the buy now, pay later phenomenon kicked in, there were many, many fintech lenders that, are now listed companies and have gone from strength to strength, but were sort of small fintech startups and scale-ups initially, but really sort of taking advantage of the appetite for consumer credit. And, now there's still an appetite for consumer credit. It's just through a buy now, pay later mechanism. So that's sort of how I'd characterise the situation in Australia at the moment and some of the strengths. I would say, though, in the last couple of years, or certainly in the last year, and I think Carl touched on this to some extent, is with the events of 2020, across the globe, there's this global thematic of more people being mobile natives, spending more time on mobile phones, not going into shops or stores or banks to interact with people. And we've actually sort of almost seen a kind of reverse a little bit, or the balance has shifted, certainly in Australia, in that there's more sort of unique, sort of niche financial apps like share trading apps, for example, or robo-advice apps that have really sort of gone, we're almost sort of struggling a little bit, or you could see them sort of running into headwinds against the larger banks and the larger financial institutions potentially, and they've actually gone from strength to strength in the last sort of 12 months or so. So it's a bit of an interesting time, but certainly I think the feeling is in Australia, the fintech ecosystem has sort of weathered the storm as well as can be expected, and actually has sort of shown a huge amount of resilience. I know that word is rolled out an awful lot and has to be at the moment, given the events going on around the world. But it's really sort of proved itself to be sort of quite tenacious and resilient. And we've been quite lucky in many respects over here as well, in that we have escaped some of the worst of the lockdowns and the economic issues that have been impacted other parts of the world. So I think we need to be cognizant and sort of acknowledge that as well. And that's perhaps why we haven't suffered in the same way that other countries and economies have.
Thank you, Ben. Dilip, as you might be aware, historically Chennai is known for its financial acumen and has established the first bank, Madras Bank. And we have technology centers of almost all the major financial institutions like the World Bank, Standard Chartered, Citigroup, PayPal. And we have Bangalore, which is the Silicon Valley of India and the tech capital. And we also have Mumbai, which is the financial capital of the country. How do you see the future forward for these cities to emerge as a global financial hubs?
See, in my opinion, the Mumbai will always remain the financial capital with a lot of focus from that perspective. But Chennai seems to be heading. It is the national capital for SaaS startups. You see a much bigger variety of startups in Bangalore across all sectors. So Bangalore, in that sense, is very spread out. Now, from a fintech perspective, if you look at it, you have, like Ben was mentioning, there are lots of companies in India right now. If you see, consumer credit is becoming a big thing. There are lots of lending companies that are starting up. So, and I personally feel from a startup perspective, Chennai and Bangalore will lead the way, primarily because of the nature of the setup that is already there. And Mumbai will always remain the financial capital with a lot of focus. But if you already look at the trends, we are seeing more and more startups that are out there. A lot of the unicorns, pretty much in the fintech space, have been from Bangalore and a few from Chennai as well. So these two cities, I think, will be startup hubs for fintech.
Thank you, Dilip. That's a good throw. Now, moving to Ben, the two of the world's leading fintech hubs, it could be Singapore and London, which are known for their progressive regulatory bodies as well. It could be the Monetary Authority of Singapore or the Financial Conduct Authority. Could you please share your insights on how government can set up and operationalize the fintech hubs in a country like India?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Singapore's a good example because it seems to be, from what I've seen, very much a top-down sort of regime, and I'd sort of the counterbalance to that is Australia, where it's very much been bottom-up. There's almost been a groundswell of innovation that's led to government involvement, and we're sort of getting some support from the government. But as far as I can tell, Singapore has benefited from that sort of top-down approach. And from what I've seen and what I've read, and perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but certainly that seems to be what's happened to some extent in India as well. Certainly with the creation of the Mumbai FinTech Hub. And other ones that sort of have been through the 2021 budgets that I've been reading about today and in the last few weeks and things like that. But I certainly think that has been certainly pushed things on in Singapore. And if you look at the events that have been sort of put on and subsidized and the amount of investment that's gone into those, the Singapore FinTech Festival is really sort of sets the scene or sets the tone for what a fintech and innovation event could be in terms of drumming up interest in the region and also attracting talent from elsewhere to both be part of that and then look to move there. I think that would definitely be where I'd be looking to go from an Indian perspective for sure.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Kyle, can you please elaborate on what should be the actual role of the government to operationalize these fintech hubs? We know it's easy to set up, have a facility, but how do you maintain and manage this has been a constant question.
I just want to add it's a bit of a synergy from the question you just asked me with the one that you asked Ben previously, right? So we have first-hand experience on what's happening in Singapore, being a Singapore-based company, and I can tell you the level of involvement from the government in structuralizing, putting in the necessary structures from it's not just setting up getting a piece of land and then saying, hey, we've got a fintech hub here now, and let's everyone start a company here. But it revolves around a number of things. So number one is very friendly regulation, right? So if you look at the Singapore government, there is an active involvement by the government itself in regulating this fintech hub, or at least the whole island state, including to a point where the Monetary Authority of Singapore actually has someone who is got a title, Chief FinTech Officer or something along those lines, right? So Swapnendu is one of the guys who's heading that up with a very clear mandate of actually fostering and actually encouraging more fintechs to domicile themselves in Singapore. So that's the first. The second is that flows on to the next part, which is talent acquisition. And I guess, maybe it's second nature back in India because of the availability of talent. But what sort of incentives you could provide actually to companies, whether it's tax incentives, like, in Singapore, there's a lot of tax incentives. In Australia, whilst we don't have direct tax incentives for fintechs, But there are tax incentives for R&D, for example. Like if you were developing something that is unique in its own nature, there's significant tax incentives from the government to develop new IP, right? I think that's the second. It is very clear that tax incentives work. London did utilize a lot of tax incentives in that sense. And finally, I think, and this is something we've seen significantly, at least in Australia, with the open banking initiative, is dismantling in some way, shape, or another, not really relaxing it, but dismantling the regulatory modes that have allowed for the large banks to create their oligopoly, right? So those are the three things that I think. So if you're going to create a fintech hub, I think the first one is that there has to be some degree of catalyst from the government to actually initiate that from very clear regulatory incentives. The second is tax incentives. And third is to actually break down the barriers that the banks have. And I think open banking, at least in Australia, we're seeing a significant shift in the level of innovation and the adoption of fintech players with the open banking initiative.
Thank you, Carl. Moving on to Dilip. So you have definitely worked out of a incubation center or plug and play during a startup stage. What do you think is an ideal incubation facility for the startups, especially in the fintech space, that government can provide? Is it just a posh plug and play working space, or what is the best way to nurture and promote innovation?
See, I think from a Z-Score perspective, we were actually very lucky. We were part of two very good incubation accelerators, rather, both in India and in Australia. So, that they've been extremely helpful. But from a government perspective, I think for fintechs, right now, it is not the plug and play offices that matter. I think there's enough amount of funding that is available right now for fintechs. Fintechs are at the heart of the funding scene right now, so funding is not a big challenge. I think startups really require a lot of help from a regulatory perspective. Most of the times, what we see is that startups eventually struggle to get regulatory information. There's not enough information outside for startups to go and make the right decision. I always say startups don't have two things. They don't have money, they don't have time. So you always need to help them in ensuring that they're able to save these two. So once you're able to give them enough amount of information right up front, save their costs from a regulatory perspective, have enough information outside, enough amount of bodies to help startups wherein they can go get information and eventually make decisions a lot more early, that will help. And that is where I think government can play a huge role, number one. Number two is the story around, say, for example, Carl was mentioning about, Australia. The Consumer Data Rights Forum is at its peak right now. In India, we have the Sri Krishna Commission report that is currently in the parliament. It is being discussed about. It is more around data privacy and data security, but it is not around consumer data rights. So that is something that will come and be of significant importance in India, because before we get our fintech story right, we need to get our data story right. Because if you don't do that, then you have problems of a completely different scale that we will be trying to solve. So the getting the data story right is extremely important. And as a country, I think India has been behind when it comes to data, especially around privacy, especially around consent. Our KYCs are, we're just getting there when it comes to KYC, but I think KYC is not enough. We need to do a lot more than that. So I think it is not just plug and play offices and other incubation facilities. Those can be given without too much of a hassle, but the other significant aspects involves around regulation, data, and of course enough amount of capability to go and get funds from the government so that companies can kickstart, especially solving problems of tier 2, tier 3 and villages. that will be the key. And companies fintechs that come from these remote areas need to have access to solve these problems, because as in when you start going down the chain, especially from a city perspective, you say, for example, a startup is coming from a tier 3 city or a remote place, the access to correct information, access to correct data is critical.
Thank you, Dilip. Carl, as Dilip mentioned, access to correct data is very difficult in India, and the financial system is not well as regulated as in Australia. How do you think the Indian startups with their tech expertise can get access to the Australian financial market?
Hey, look, I think the good thing about the Australian financial market is we are open to business, right? It's I think Australia is one of the easiest places to do business in, and Ben would agree with me. At least with the fintech industry and fintech sector, it's a very tight knit community. So setting up a business here, it's fairly straightforward, and to actually build scale. Fintech Australia is very active in promoting new launched fintechs and so forth, right? I think that's the first step. The second step is, so that's the easy part, right? So establishing the business and setting up your operations. There's multiple incubators and so forth to get access into. I think the harder challenge is to actually understand what is the problem you're solving for, right? So as a fairly well-developed country, majority of issues that you'd naturally think of in India may not apply in Australia. However, things like Z-Score in that Dilip is doing, or maybe it's a cheap plugin for him here in this call, right? It's actually bringing in a set of technology that it's hard to solve for, like, whether it's machine learning, pattern recognition, and crunching huge amounts of data and so forth. We just don't have the depth of talent pool to actually solve for those kind of problems. So if you think of, sectors that would have, a requirement for depth of tech talent, and that's certainly one of them. And I think the next step is to ascertain the other way around, right? So how can fintechs actually bring a degree of capabilities that they can actually extract value for folks in Australia that need to get into India, for example? We don't have that bridge. I think I started this conversation, Soumya, with the fact that we built our business, Niam built our business with solving a simple problem. How do people actually move money from Australia to India without being, scammed by the banks, where, close to, sometimes up to 15-20% of money that is being remitted that will be siphoned off by the banks through fees and charges, right? It was a very simple problem, at the face of it, but underlying it from the regulation, I think Dilip mentioned KYC. We still find that challenging in some nations where we don't have automated access. So those are the kind of things that I think about. The three things is, the first one is setting up a business is the more easier part, and getting access to Fintech Australia to promote your business and actually building the networks, that's the easier part. But ascertaining the actual problem that you're solving for in country, that is going to be more crucial. But I think is bridging the gap between the two countries and actually facilitating trade is going to be the biggest, right?
Yes, that is absolutely, that's a problem. And I think Ben has a technology platform for startups. I would like to know if we can have a technology platform that can enable the cross-border knowledge sharing across Indian and Australian fintech startups, not just startups, Indian, Australian fintechs, so that we can complement each other's trends.
Well, I think so, and I think probably just touching on a couple of the previous questions as well, and one that sort of runs quite in parallel to this. effectively a technology bridge, which is sharing information, sharing talent both ways. Probably something that could be considered going forward is looking to replicate the fintech bridges that Australia has with Hong Kong, with Singapore, and with the UK, for example. So I certainly think there'd be some merit in establishing that, and that's more collaboration, sharing of ideas. There's trade missions in person when we're allowed to do that again, or when that's possible. But then I suppose in conjunction with that, you could have a technology platform that again is effectively tossing ideas, skills, knowledge, sharing ideas across the fence, leveraging partnerships in particular that are successful, in different countries. So I definitely think that's something that should be fully explored. I think that's been quite a successful project for Australia with all of those countries that I just mentioned. I think as well, sort of in terms of the right sort of incubation model, I think I definitely agree with what Dilip said in terms of the plug and play startup hubs. Is an interesting concept, and I think we've perhaps gone so far with that. I think you probably have to work pretty hard on pushing those things to the next step. And what I like, or what I've seen, is kind of a hybrid model, the like of which you've got at Antler. Now that's a global, I guess you'd call it a hybrid incubator. There's an Antler in Sydney. I believe the first cohort is going live in Bangalore this year. I think it's the winter cohort. So that's a model that I quite like. And obviously, I think there has been some success. Well, no, a lot of success with Y Combinator and Sequoia Surge in India as well. So, I think I think probably we've just moved on a little bit from that sort of plug and play startup model, and we need to be a bit more involved in supporting those startups with things like stakeholder access, collaboration, access to corporates in a meaningful way. I think something that perhaps we haven't done so well with some of our startup hubs in Australia is really taken full advantage of the potential of the corporate partnerships. I think they've very much been sort of a sponsorship deal, maybe some office hours, and it hasn't been sort of fully realised the potential and the learnings that could happen both ways there. So I certainly think there's a few things to explore with definite potential in the incubation model. And then the final point I just make on open banking and the legislative regime change that we've had in Australia that has extreme potential going forward. And to Carl's point, it's probably going to change the way consumers interact with their finances going forward over the next 3 to 5 and then 5 to 10 years beyond measure. But at the moment, the people who are asking for access to this most often, and I'm having conversations on a daily basis about this, are fintech startups, fintech scale-ups, medium-sized fintechs, and even more mature fintechs who are actually being priced out of the market at the moment by the cost to take part in the regime. So I think there's still a bit of work to be done to actually achieve what the open banking or the consumer data right regime is actually set out to achieve. And again, that's something to bear in mind going forward. Although I think in India there's a hybrid model that is perhaps a bit more reflective of the US model, where corporates and financial institutions are opening up and sharing their APIs rather than a legislation-driven model, which is what we've got in Australia and has really been informed by the UK and European model.
Hello, Soumya, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I think we lost Ben.
Yeah, I think Ben is temporarily not there. I think he's having some issues.
Okay, so Dilip, as Ben was mentioning, the Australian regulated fintech startups which have developed the fintech products. How do you, as we know that India fintech adoption rate is very high, next to China, how do you think we can leverage this as an opportunity and could bring Australian innovative solutions to grab the market in India? What is the best way to promote this?
I think, see, right now for software, we have a body like NASSCOM. I think we need a similar body like that separately for fintech. In Australia, there's Fintech Australia. We are part of Fintech Australia, and Fintech Australia does a great job in talking to the government about CDR, about other options, say, for example, about other core regulation issues. So there's a body that represents the government and takes care of the decisions and ensures that the best of decisions are being made with the startups represented, and their what should I say requests are fulfilled as well. So we need that kind of a body that can work with startups. So it's important. So right now, I don't think it's kind of very sporadic. Say, for example, in Bangalore, we have a Bangalore FinTech Forum. In Hyderabad, you have a Hyderabad FinTech Forum, and these are individual WhatsApp groups. And right now, there is no single body that actually collectively talks to. I mean, in India, you need a body that talks to the state government. You need a body that talks to the central government. So, and we have to solve problems at different levels. Okay, so predominantly the decisions are taken by the central government. So eventually you'll have to talk to them, but there are a few decisions which are state government specific as well. So you need state government based bodies, and you need a central body like the NASSCOM to represent startups. And I think that is key. That is number one. And number two is you need to have a technical body which is approachable by startups. A technical body that understands what it means to go and if I have to if I have to create a new company in India in the fintech space, and it is a highly regulated space, for example, how does it work, and what are the regulations that I need to understand? What are the data aspects that I need to understand? How much do I need to invest? So you need a guidance system, because as and when we start getting more and more deeper into fintech, the rules and regulations are going to get more and more complicated. It's not going to get any lesser. So as and when these regulations become more and more complicated, you need help. I know a lot of startups which have been struggling to not being able to find information. They've not been able to get certain information out from the government, and then eventually, when they go and approach and work with corporates, they've been having issues. Like Ben had mentioned, there has to be a greater collaboration between corporates and startups, especially in the fintech space, because when it comes to scale, I don't think not every company is going to get millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars funding from investors. So you will have to take the corporate route to eventually reach out to your customers. So there has to be a very strong corporate startup relationship, and the government can help there as well. And again, a body like a fintech body in India can help achieve that. And so it's critical that we get it. And as far as I know, I think there is some discussion around these going on, but we need to move a little more faster as well.
Great, that's a good one actually. A technical body, like that is how the Monetary Authority of Singapore is able to promote innovation, especially. Moving on to Carl, I would like to know, like, as Dilip has already mentioned, the financial institutions, most of them have innovation centers and all, but it has been most of the companies are seeing it as like a cost center as of now, an innovation team or something. How do you make it mainstream, and how do we engage them to be part of the innovation?
Hey, look, I can only talk from my personal experience out here in Australia, and I think there's an element of cultural differences here as well. And Dilip, you might have greater experience in financial institutions in India, but let me start with Australia first, right? So the most, I was just about to mention this, Soumya, and it's just uncanny that you asked this question. One of the most successful fintech investment arms so happened to be out of a bank called Reinventure, right? It's not run by the bank. It's actually seed funded by Westpac, and they've gone on to do some really amazing investments including some of the BNPLs, early BNPLs, and Basic, which is Bank's competitor, but a whole bunch of them. And the way they achieved that was by segregating the investment arm from the natural banking capabilities. And there's a reason for that, right? So if you think about banks and legacy banks, they are large governance machines which have got multiple hierarchies and multiple layers of people. And when you have layers of people, I suppose decision making often is delayed, and often there's lack of clarity on absolute decision-making rights, right? So things take time, and if a fintech decides to work with a bank, God forbid, it's going to take them years before they actually successfully embed themselves in a bank, right? So coming back to your question, how would this work? Look, my thinking is, and having been in a couple of the big banks here, some fairly successful and some haven't been successful in actually adopting innovation, has been those that have actually embraced it from, let's make our investment and then let our internal teams do whatever they need to do. Coming back to that though, however, one of the things that is pushing some of the changes and adoption to innovation, at least in Australia, among the big four banks, has been this whole thing about open banking. And, Ben, you might add a little bit more color to this, but I suspect there's been a flurry of either acquisition or adoption of new technology, given that they know that if they don't adopt, they're going to die, right? Or they're going to be disrupted. A good example was the recent UBank purchase of 86400. I think it is a very successful. There's a mixed views, but I'll share my view. So 86400 was an incubated fintech out of one of the business banking arms, or one of the business banks in Australia. And they grew successfully. I think there was about 300,000 customers, a good tech stack, which got bought over by National Australia Bank's digital banking arm called UBank, right? Now, one would argue and say, hey, this is a big bank taking out competition, but I look at it differently, right? It's exactly what you want. You get entrepreneurs creating, innovating, and it gives them an opportunity to exit the business because they see a big bank or a big financial institution having the clout and the capital to take them to the next level. So if you're an entrepreneur, it's either you are taking on the world and you think you have the access to capital to take on the world, or you get to a point where you realize you need a partner, and that partner is going to take you to the next scale up or grow your business to the next 10x. And I think this is what's happening, and you're going to see that a lot more, at least in developed countries. And I suspect that's going to be the same in India. You've got, really large stoic banks that are going to be looking at it and saying, hey, wait a minute, you just need someone to solve and I think, Dilip, this is where you were getting to, the second, third tier towns and villages and all of that, and solving for financial inclusion and financial services at that level. You would automatically see business behaviors change, right, in the big four banks or big banks in India.
Samya, can I add one thing, if it's okay?
Yeah, sure.
So going back to what Carl said, we, and also the question, we actually were working with, we're talking to SBI General Insurance. State Bank is the largest bank in India, okay? And we all know the perception of a large state-owned bank. What is the perception? They are slow, they are, it takes time. I was particularly very surprised because when we engaged with SBI, we had the COO respond the next. I sent him an email. He responded within half an hour, and he connected me to somebody. And I had a call with that person, and I eventually gave them a run through of the product, and everything happened within a week. And that is something phenomenal. The same thing with companies like ICICI. So we are seeing that kind of, change happening. But at the same time, I was in a forum, in a Indo-UK forum, And we were talking with a bunch of banks, and the banks were just, they just came out blatantly and said, we know this is wrong, but if you have to work with us, a deal will take 18 months to close, whether you like it or you don't like it. We know it is wrong, but we can't help it because our processes are that way. And if it is going to take 18 months to close a deal, then I think it's a startup killer. I think startups won't survive. Like I said, startups don't have time, they don't have money. So you can't wait for 18 months. So it's critical that you're able to, start, start services early, give, startups a chance to work and, pay them as soon as possible so that they can keep going. And eventually, startups will come up with different business models to ensure that they can survive. The bank can also ensure that their services can continue. But as I think this is critical. But what we're seeing is in India, large banks, large financial institutions are getting are understanding the need, and they're taking necessary steps as well.
Great, that's good to know, Dalap. Ben, as you've been connecting the startups and corporates, what do you think is the best way to connect these startups and corporates? Is it taking the use cases?
Oops.
Ben, okay. So we just wanted to know what is the best way to connect. Is it taking the problems from the corporates and the startups to work on the solutions? Or which is working better?
I think I know where the question's going, and so I'll have a stab at it. But I think it really depends. I think the points that the guys made are really interesting, and I think in Australia, as far as I can tell, certainly compared to the UK, I think there is an openness to adopt innovation. I think what's been quite interesting is that the major banks or the larger institutions in Australia, as a rule, haven't tried to run their own sort of fintech divisions or their fintech startups. And I think there've been a few sort of highly publicized, failures in the UK. And I think in Australia, there's probably a degree of sort of caution about sort of building your own startup if you're in a large institution. And therefore, a prime example in Australia is the acquisition of 86400 by National Australia Bank under the UBank arm. They saw a reasonably well established, or getting to be quite well established, relatively agile, relatively innovative business that they were able to pick up probably relatively cheaply, all things considered, given that making real cut through against the big banks in Australia is quite tricky. So it's a really interesting one, and as Carl alluded to, there's two sides to this. Some people sort of view it as a bit of a negative thing, in that sort of innovation is being stymied and quelled and taken into a larger institution. But the flip side is that we've had a successful neobank exit in Australia, and given that it is it's well acknowledged that it's extremely tough to set up a new bank in Australia, I think that has to be a happy outcome all around. I think the banks here, we've got Commonwealth Bank of CBA, which is the biggest bank in Australia by quite some margin, the biggest of the big four. They have a hub or a venture called X15, where they're actually incubating several other startups within the CBA or Commonwealth Bank environment. And I was down there visiting a startup last week or a couple of weeks ago, and it's a seriously impressive operation. I don't know if you've been down there yet, Carl, but it's a real sort of tech hub that they've got going on, with various different sort of incubated startups operating off the core CBA sort of new building outside of Sydney, which I think will be a sort of new tech hub or a new sort of tech area. And I suppose you can sort of say, well, on the one hand, it's them keeping their eye on interesting startups that they'll then just absorb into CBA. But, on the flip side, they're actually supporting and nurturing these startups and giving them the benefit of their expertise and also their investment. So, yes, it's not an easy question to answer in terms of the best model. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach by any means. And I think you really sort of have to, the startup founders that I've seen succeed have really, gone all out, and they've spent a lot of time pounding the pavement, going to meet with some of these larger institutions, and then people who have ended up partnering with them or acquiring with them. have done so, but it's been a long road, and it's not easy for sure.
Hey, Soumya, maybe I'm just going to add a little bit more color to that. Ben, you just triggered thinking. I'd love to go and see X15. I was there before the pandemic, but it was nothing like what you mentioned. I know Tyro has got something similar as well. So I think there's a couple of things here that is interesting. You know, when we talked about talent, one thing fintechs are really good at is building the tech side and scaling that tech. I mean, there's no two things about it. You know, they are able to solve problems rapidly because of the entrepreneurial spirit and the willingness to accept those challenges, right? But I think where we're seeing a degree of failure is the lack of understanding of finance. And this is where banks could actually collaborate. And maybe, Ben, I'm not familiar with the X15 model. I suspect there would be some degree of infusion of banking talent into those fintech startups, either through a mentoring program or some sort of coaching, sharing of ideas. Because, you know, it's one thing building the tech side, but when you come to, let's say, lending and actually building out, you know, consumer lending or business lending or any form of lending, the requirement to actually understand the finance side is critical. And this is where the complementary skill set could occur. And I think we're seeing that increasingly so, at least in Australia, where there's some degree of collaboration between those things. And those that are successful, Ben, you'd agree with this, like whether it's Judo or Athena that have been very successful in their launch, are actually finance-first businesses that then went on to actually acquire some of the technology to solve for their problems. And they did partner with some of the fintechs on the back end that you don't hear about, but you know they're being powered by the fintechs to solve for the problems that they were intending to solve for.
Correct.
Thank you, Carl. I think that's what I wanted to ask you. The next question was more on the talent side and the financial systems knowledge, which India has a tech talent, but financial systems knowledge may not be with the startups. I think most of them are only into tech side, and I think you've added on that. Can you suggest any courses or something that have been implemented in Singapore or London that we can also replicate, which can increase the knowledge of the financial systems during their graduation itself?
Look, I'm sure there's, you know, we've got this saying, there's horses for courses here. You can do as many courses, and there's plenty out there. But I think, you know, let me loop this back to what the government can do, right? And I think what the government can do is actually facilitating that cross-pollination of folks. So, for example, like, you know, Singapore, one is they make it easy for staff to be embedded into other companies, right? So whether if I'm a bank and I'm lending my staff, I might get some tax incentive for it. And then I might consider, hey, that might be worthwhile to actually second people into this area. I mean, this is just throwing it out there, right? But I think it's not something you learn. You know, there's a lot of things that you could pick up a textbook and read and learn about it. But when it comes to finance, I think it's the experience that matter, because sometimes, especially in credit lending, understanding, you know, credit scores and having depth of knowledge in terms of, you know, whether it's the local market environment, this is where it becomes critical to actually have, you know, a seasoned hand. And I suspect the best way to learn is mentoring and coaching, right? And I think the other thing as well is, you know, this is where, you know, the age-old philosophies of the, you know, which originated in many ancient cultures like even India, right, where you have a teacher and the teacher teaches his students. And I think there's some element of truth to that. You know, you could pick up a book and read it, but unless you have a teacher to teach you and walk through that path, it's meaningless knowledge. And I suspect this is where, you know, whether it's through government or some form of fintech think tank, it's going to be highly valuable, is that cross-pollination of ideas.
Just to add to that, Carl, as well, I think it's a really good point. I mean, the tech talent's one thing, but the commercial talent is really another thing altogether. In Australia, I don't know if we've got too much sort of... The only thing I can think of that I've seen is programs like the Antler program, where they actually encourage people to come out of corporates, to come out of consulting or investment banking, and provide a fast track with some pay along the way to tide you over for a period, and really sort of upskill you on the whole sort of entrepreneurship piece. So they can actually leverage the corporate skills that you've got and really sort of get you prepared for what startup and scale up life might be like. As I say, I think the first Antler program is in Bangalore this year. But yeah, apart from that, I've not seen too much else in terms of that sort of upskilling of or cross-pollination of across different divisions or skill sets.
I think yesterday there was a news that Sachin Tendulkar signed up with a company called Unacademy to actually deliver classes on how to be a leader and things like that. So I think it's just a beginning for experienced entrepreneurs to also use such platforms. Not necessarily an academy, but India is now full of edtech platforms. You can use one of these platforms. You can come and provide those kind of training for entrepreneurs, and I think that will be a great way to reach out to people at scale.
Thanks, Dilip. I think we've covered mostly on the regulation side and right now on the talent side, and we also covered on the demand side. On the capital side, how easy it is for an Indian startup to get funding? It's good in cities like Bangalore, but what about the other parts of the country? What is your say on that?
You're asking me? Okay. So, see, funding is a funny thing, there's no specific formula for funding. You could be, I think, in my opinion, there are enough amount of investments that are available, investment companies that are available to fund. But in India, funding has been very skewed to a large extent. It's not like the Valley. It is not like Silicon Valley, where you have a lot of people who take risks when it comes to funding. There's, say, for example, you have in fintech, you see, a couple of companies in lending getting funded. Then you'll see a whole bunch of Me Too startups coming in that space, and everybody will get funded. And then you have another scenario where you have a payments startup getting funded, and that company eventually gets on to maybe become a couple of $100 million valuation. You'll see more startups coming, and funding will go there. So there's the investment, space in India is still, for me, it is. I'm very unclear on how it works. So I'm probably not the right person. And I've also seen that in India, we need to look at enterprise startups a little more intensely, because enterprise startups versus consumer startups are very different. Enterprise startups, whether you like it or you don't like it, there is a longer sales cycle. So it will take more time for them to eventually start making revenue, but they are a lot more bankable, as opposed to the risk is a lot more lesser as opposed to others. So we'll have to start looking along those lines and eventually start maturing in that way. But from a funding perspective, I think there is enough money enough capital in India. The other aspect is, I think, from a government perspective, places like Singapore, where if you start up, you can actually get access to funding relatively quickly. You can get up to about $300,000 in some sense or the other from the government. Okay. In India, you don't have to really pay $300,000. Even about $50,000 would suffice, because the cost of talent is relatively lesser in India. But right now, access to those government funds is being a challenge, because not every startup is able to go and understand that. And people don't really go to government for the funds primarily, especially in the software sector. I think there is a great amount of funding that happens in the energy sector where the government directly takes part. I think the software sector has become too crowded, so the government is not getting involved, and it has given the funds to investment companies to handle them. I think the government can do a better job in giving this handling these startups a lot more proactively and a lot more better. So I think that can help startups to a large extent, very large extent.
So can I just add a little
Do you
bit?
support?
Can I just add a little
Yeah,
bit more
sorry.
color to what Dilip said? Right. I think there's the general trend in terms of fintech is there's plenty of money floating around the world today looking for a home to invest in. I think that's a known fact. As long as governments are pump priming across the globe, there is enough money. I think the question a lot of entrepreneurs got to ask is, am I creating a product that is solving a problem big enough that can attract that money? And that is going to be in stages as well. So often, is to get the flywheel effect. The seed funding is where Dilip is getting at. Hey, can the government actually incentivize $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 to get these guys off that curve to at least launch a product that is worthy enough to scale? But once you get to a scale stage, I think, if you look at even your domestic market, right, is big enough to sustain itself. I mean, even in Australia, with the population size of 25, 30 million people, tech startups or fintechs are getting, enough funding to actually get their business to scale. So I think funding in its own right is not an issue, given the greater focus of a lot of these a lot of investors are looking for home for their funds, right? I think the greater part for a lot of tech entrepreneurs out there is to ascertain whether I'm building a product that is big enough to solve a problem, or maybe it is not big enough, and therefore I'm unable to attract investment dollars.
Great. As we are getting close to the end of the time together, there is one thing that you would like the audience to take away from the session. What would it be? Maybe we can start with Ben.
Oh, look, I would say, well, there's a few things, but the one that springs to mind is I think we're probably only seeing the tip of the iceberg for fintech at the moment. I think there's so much momentum around it. I think there's so much sort of legislative change that is still really, really embryonic or nascent. And I think probably the horizon that we kind of need to keep in the back of our minds, or certainly here in Australia, is not necessarily the next 2 to 5 years, but the next 5 to 10 years. And it's sort of both scary and exciting to contemplate what the financial system or your financial life might look like, or your data life might look like as a consumer in 5 to 10 years' time. And I think that will be worth all of the slow and painful processes we're going through at the moment. I think certainly in India, I think the ongoing adoption of technology, a growing middle class, more and more unbanked people being banked or being able to use technology or fintech to access financial services is just going to continue to move at pace. So I think the future is looking extremely bright.
Thank you, Ben. And one final thought from you.
That for me, I missed the Dilip or myself, Soumya.
Kyle, one thought. Kyle, yes.
Okay, I'm going to give two because I like giving one and giving one free as well, right? So the first one is to at least my Indian audience, right? Don't be afraid of being Indian. You don't have to copy, international ideas and all that, because there's plenty of problems in India in itself. And, having that cultural linkage to the home country does wonders, right? So I think that's the first one. So taking ownership of being Indian. The second is, I think this whole origin story of fintechs, right? So there was an origin story, was 2009 and the global financial crisis. And it was seen as a means to disrupt banking. Get rid of the old bankers. They are old. They don't know what they're doing. I would encourage the audience to change their mindset to think, how can I work with the banks? Maybe not now, but like what Ben is saying, in 3, 4, 5 years' time, how can I build a product that eventually A, could lead me to an exit, or B, could actually be something the banks themselves might want to use. I think that is a mindset shift from the origin story of fintech, and I think we're going to see that play out a lot more in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Carl. Dilip, any key point that you would like to share?
Two things. One is, first is India is you have a fintech aspect in India, then there's a talent aspect in India. So the fintech market, I think we can build for India. India is a massive, massive, massive market. You don't have to go and solve problems outside. It's up to you, but there's enough amount of opportunities. Okay, so some of these opportunities, and there's space, there's room for everybody. Just like how food is food market is a abyss. Similarly, fintech market will also have ample amount of appetite. There's room for everybody, number one. Number two is, fintech is not just about solving only payment problems. There's data issues. There are so many other aspects to fintech. So you should probably look at it in a much more diversified way for us to understand that. The second aspect is a talent aspect. India is going to be a talent hub for the world. And I think it is key that we talk about working together with countries like Australia, working with countries like Singapore, to ensure that cross-pollination happens very, very well. People from talent can be used across these countries, so that there's mutual benefit for both parties. So that is, so skill development and restriction of what should I say, regulations and friendlies, we need to improve on those kind of aspects. The moment we do that, I think we are looking at a very, very, very different scenario.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, everyone. It was actually a brilliant discussion. And Government of Tamil Nadu is planning to establish a fintech city in Chennai. And all your insights are really helpful to us. These are the things that we've been also planning to set up. It could be the technical body that Dilip was talking about, or the tech talent along with the financial acumen, the skill development around those areas, and incubation center with innovation facilities. All these we've been discussing about, and I think this is very helpful to us to take it forward. And now let us see if we have any questions from the AIME platform. Hi, Thomas. Do we have any questions? We cannot see anything here. Okay, I don't think we have any questions. Thank you, everyone. We hope the session was insightful, and special thanks to the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce for putting all of us together for such a wonderful discussion as part of the virtual trade mission to Australia, tech and innovation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for the chance.
Bye. See you.
See ya.
See you. Bye.